Princess Zalara stood at the edge of the Thraxian warship, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. The dark void of space stretched out before her, endless and full of mysteries. She was a princess of the Thraxi, a race known for their strength and unmatched power. To them, humans were little more than an interesting curiosity, weak and primitive creatures who didn't belong in the grand design of the universe. But she was not like others of her kind. Zalara refused to be bound to anyone, especially a human. She had heard the stories. Humans, with their short lives and chaotic cultures, always under the shadow of war and conflict. The Thraxi had never needed them, and Zalara had no intention of changing that. She wasn't interested in learning from them or partnering with them. No, she was above all that. As the future ruler of the Thraxian Empire, she had enough on her plate without having to waste time on creatures like humans. The mission she was on, however, was not a simple one. She had been sent to observe the human colonies on a far-off planet, a small and seemingly insignificant outpost that had attracted Thraxian interest. But Zalara couldn't shake the feeling that it was beneath her. The entire journey felt like a distraction from more important matters. She sighed, her violet eyes narrowed with irritation. "Princess," came the voice of her advisor, Kelrix. The old Thraxian walked up beside her, his steps silent on the ship's smooth metal floor. "We are approaching the human settlement." Zalara didn't respond right away. She wasn't interested in the humans or their small primitive outposts. She had seen more important places than this in her lifetime. But her father, the Thraxian emperor, had ordered her to go. As usual, Zalara had to obey. "We will land shortly," Kelrix added, his voice filled with an almost uncharacteristic hint of concern. "I've heard there are human soldiers stationed there. You must be careful, Princess." Zalara turned to him, her expression hardening. "I do not need their protection. I will handle things my way." Kelrix looked at her, his wise eyes filled with uncertainty. He had seen many things in his time, but he knew that Zalara's pride often led her into difficult situations. She would learn soon enough that not everything could be controlled through sheer will. The shuttle finally touched down, the landing gear softly settling into the dust of the foreign planet. The air was thick with the scent of Earth and the sounds of human activity. It was unlike anything Zalara had experienced before. The humans lived in small, makeshift structures, and the air smelled of machinery and sweat. The planet was far from the pristine worlds of the Thraxi, but Zalara had been told it was valuable to the Empire for its resources. As the ramp lowered, a group of human soldiers stood waiting. They were in their standard military uniforms, their faces serious but cautious. Zalara stepped off the ramp, her regal presence undeniable even on this primitive planet. One of the soldiers, a tall man with dark hair and a scar on his cheek, stepped forward. "Princess Zalara," he said, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "We're here to assist you." Zalara looked him over, her expression one of quiet disdain. Humans were always so eager to please, so quick to offer assistance. She had no need for it. "I do not require assistance," she said coldly. "I will manage on my own." The soldier didn't flinch, though Zalara could sense his confusion. "Understood, Your Highness," he said, his voice calm. "But we're here to make sure you're safe. The area is not entirely secure." I said, "I do." "Not need protection," she snapped, turning on her heel and walking past him. Her pace was brisk, her head held high. She was a princess, and she would not be told what to do by a mere soldier. The soldier, however, didn't follow her. Instead, he remained in his place, watching her with a mixture of respect and something else she couldn't place. Zalara knew. She had made her position clear, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this soldier was different. As she explored the settlement, she kept to herself, making mental notes of the layout and the humans' ways of life. She studied their crude tools and structures, unimpressed by their lack of sophistication. She didn't understand why her father had taken such an interest in them. They were weak, struggling to survive in a harsh galaxy. But as the day went, Zalara found herself growing more irritated. There was a buzz in the air, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. She could see the soldiers working tirelessly, but there was something about their focus that struck her as unusual. The soldier with the scar on his face was among them, moving with purpose and precision. Zalara watched him for a moment, intrigued, despite herself. There was a quiet strength about him, something that commanded respect. He was different from the others. He didn't seem afraid to challenge her. For the first time since arriving on this planet, Zalara felt the smallest flicker of doubt. She was used to being in control, used to being the one who commanded respect. But this soldier, this human, seemed to defy her expectations, and that irritated her more than anything. As the day wore on, Zalara finally returned to the base's main building, her mind racing. She had tried to shake off the unsettling thoughts, but they refused to leave her. She was the princess of the Thraxi, the future ruler of a great empire. She didn't need anyone, especially not a human soldier. Yet the encounter lingered, like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She pushed open the door to her quarters and stepped inside. The room was simple, but it suited her. There were no unnecessary luxuries here, just the bare essentials. She needed nothing more. She could hear the sounds of the humans outside, still going about their business. The soldier was likely still out there, working. But Zalara knew one thing. She had no intention of letting anyone, especially not a human, get too close. She was not bound by them, and she never would be. Sergeant Marcus Caldwell stood in the shadow of the command center, watching the princess as she made her way toward the base. His eyes tracked her every move, but he didn't let his thoughts linger too long. He had a job to do. And he knew exactly what that job was. Princess Zalara, he had said earlier when she arrived. It was a formal greeting, but he couldn't hide the slight surprise in his voice. The princess was a sight to behold, her violet eyes, regal posture, and the unmistakable aura of power that surrounded her. But Marcus had been trained to keep his focus. A soldier's job was to protect, not admire. The princess had made her feelings clear. She didn't want protection, didn't want help. Marcus couldn't understand it. She was a royal, someone who had never experienced real danger in her life, yet she refused the protection he was trained to provide. Stubborn, he muttered under his breath. His team had been assigned to keep an eye on her, just in case something went wrong, but the princess had made it clear she didn't need anyone. She was strong, capable, and used to being in control. And to a soldier like Marcus, that made it even harder to ignore her defiance. The next day, Marcus was assigned to patrol the area near the princess's quarters. He didn't mind the task. It gave him time to think. But he couldn't deny the frustration he felt whenever he thought about the princess. She was smart, capable, and didn't seem to care about anyone's help, especially not his. As he walked through the base, Marcus kept his eyes open for any sign of trouble. The humans stationed on the planet were a mix of soldiers, scientists, and engineers, all focused on the task of surveying the planet's resources. But there were always dangers lurking, especially in a place like this. The princess may not have wanted help, but Marcus was trained to protect whether she liked it or not. He paused for a moment when he saw her. Princess Zalara was walking alone, her back straight and her head held high as if the world itself bent to her will. Her long, dark hair flowed behind her, and the soft light of the planet's sun reflected off her silver armor. She looked every bit the part of a princess, regal and proud. But to Marcus there was something about her that didn't seem right. She was too confident, too sure of herself, and it bothered him. "Princess," he called out, his voice strong but respectful. She turned to face him, her violet eyes narrowing. "I told you, Sergeant, I don't need your help." "I'm just making sure you're safe," he replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "The area's not entirely secure. We've had some reports of enemy scouts nearby." Zalara gave him a dismissive glance. "I can handle myself," she said, her voice cold. Marcus wasn't surprised. She had made it clear from the start that she didn't want anyone interfering in her business. But as a soldier, it was his duty to ensure her safety whether she liked it or not. You're still on our watch, Princess, Marcus said, his voice firm but not harsh. And I'll be following orders to make sure you're safe, whether you want me around or not. Zalara's eyes flashed with annoyance, but she said nothing. She simply turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, watching her go. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus found himself walking alone through the base. He had a moment to himself, a rare luxury. The night air was cool and the stars above glittered like diamonds in the vast expanse of space. He took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. There was a lot on his shoulders. The mission, the princess, and everything in between. As he rounded a corner, he saw her again, Princess Zalara, standing by herself near the edge of the settlement. She was staring at the stars, her expression distant, almost wistful. For a moment, Marcus considered walking away, letting her have her space. But something about the way she stood there, as if the weight of the universe was on her shoulders, stopped him. "Princess," he said, his voice quieter now, softer than before. Zalara didn't turn around. "I told you I don't need you," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I know," Marcus replied, "but I don't think you've fully realized yet that you're not as alone as you think." Zalara turned to face him then, her eyes flashing with anger. "What do you mean?" "I am alone. I always have been. That's the way of the Thraxian royal family. I am burdened with duty, and I am responsible for my people. I don't have the luxury of weakness. I can't afford to rely on anyone." There was a brief silence between them. Marcus could feel the weight of her words. It was clear that being a princess came with a lot of responsibility, but there was something else, something in her voice, in her eyes, that made him wonder if it was also the source of her loneliness. "You don't have to be alone," Marcus said quietly. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself. You're not weak if you accept help. Strength comes from knowing when to rely on others." Zalara's gaze softened for a moment, but she quickly masked it with a cold expression. "I don't need anyone's help," she repeated, her voice steady. But Marcus saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was brief, but it was there, and for the first time, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invincible as she thought. Later that night, as Marcus lay in his quarters, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Princess Zalara, so proud, so determined, but also so distant. There was something about her that drew him in, something beyond her royal title. She was human in a way, despite her alien heritage. She was driven by a deep sense of duty, of responsibility, and that made her more relatable than she probably realized. But there was another part of him too, the soldier, the part of him that knew he was trained to protect, to fight, and to serve. It didn't matter what Zalara thought. He had his orders, and he wasn't about to let her put herself in danger just because she was too proud to accept help. The days on the alien planet were growing longer, and the tension between Princess Zalara and Sergeant Marcus Caldwell was palpable. Zalara had made it clear from the start that she didn't want Marcus's help. Yet the circumstances were forcing them to work together, whether she liked it or not. Zalara stood on the edge of the rocky cliff, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The wind whipped her dark hair around her face, and the cold bite of the planet's atmosphere felt like a constant reminder that this place was not her home. She had never been one to accept weakness, yet here she was, stranded far from her empire, surrounded by a hostile environment and a human she had no interest in. "Princess," Marcus's voice called out from behind her. He was always there. It seemed, always following her, always making sure she was safe. Despite her irritation, she couldn't help but admit that there was something strangely reassuring about his constant presence. Turning to face him, she raised an eyebrow. "What now, Sergeant?" "We need to find shelter before nightfall. The temperature drops fast on this planet," Marcus said, his tone calm, steady, as always. He had become a constant in her life these past few days, and despite her best efforts to ignore it, she had begun to rely on him. She had even started to notice his skills. Marcus was resourceful, knowledgeable about the land and capable of surviving in conditions that would have defeated most others. But she wasn't going to admit that to him. Not yet. Solara nodded. "Lead the way," she said, turning on her, heel and beginning to walk. Marcus fell in step behind her, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The terrain was treacherous, with jagged rocks and thick brush, but Marcus knew it well. His military training had prepared him for far worse. They walked for hours, their conversation minimal. Solara's thoughts were on the planet, on the mission her father had sent her on, and on the growing frustration that Marcus wasn't as easily dismissed as she had hoped. The more time she spent with him, the more she realized he wasn't like other humans. He wasn't weak, wasn't afraid to challenge her, and worst of all, he wasn't impressed by her title or her power. For the first time in her life, Solara found herself feeling uncertain. As the sun began to set, they came across a small cave nestled in the side of a mountain. Marcus immediately moved into action, gathering firewood and setting up a small campfire. Solara, on the other hand, remained silent, watching the flames flicker as the warmth spread through the air. She had grown accustomed to the cold, but she couldn't deny the comfort the fire brought. She stood in silence, her thoughts once again turning inward. She had always prided herself on being in control of everything around her, but here, on this barren planet, she felt like nothing more than a visitor. "Thank you," she said quietly, surprising herself with the words. It was the first time she had acknowledged Marcus's help. She didn't know why she had said it, but the words felt right even though they felt foreign on her tongue. Marcus glanced up, offering a small smile. "You're welcome, Princess. We'll get through this together." Solara frowned, but she didn't argue. Instead, she sat down near the fire, watching as Marcus worked to arrange their makeshift camp. It was strange, really. Here she was, a princess who had never had to depend on anyone, sitting in a cave on a strange planet with a human soldier who was quickly becoming the only person she could count on. The next few days were a blur of harsh survival. The planet's terrain was unforgiving, with violent storms and harsh temperatures. Solara found herself relying more and more on Marcus's knowledge. He guided her through the wilderness, teaching her how to hunt, how to find water, and how to make shelter from the elements. It was difficult for her to admit it, but she was learning from him. At night, they sat around the fire, speaking little. Marcus seemed to know when to give her space and when to offer a quiet word of encouragement. His presence, though gruff and no-nonsense, had a calming effect on her. The more time she spent with him, the more she began to question her previous assumptions about humans. They weren't all weak and powerless. Some, like Marcus, had a quiet strength she had never expected. One night, as the fire crackled between them, Solara found herself speaking without thinking. "I never imagined I would be here," she said, her voice soft in the darkness. "Far from home. Far from everything I've ever known." Marcus glanced at her, his face illuminated by the firelight. "None of us ever expect to be in these situations, Princess. Life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges our way." Solara didn't respond immediately. She wasn't used to being vulnerable, to speaking of her fears or uncertainties. But with Marcus, there was a strange comfort in it. For the first time, she wasn't worried about maintaining the image of the perfect, untouchable royal. She was just a person sitting next to a man who had earned her respect. "We'll get back," Marcus said after a moment. "You'll get back to your empire, and I'll get back to my unit. It's just a matter of survival now." Solara nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. She had no doubt that they would survive. But there was something else she hadn't expected. A strange connection that was slowly building between her and Marcus. She didn't understand it, didn't know how to handle it. All she knew was that he was no longer just a soldier to her. He had become something more, someone she trusted. The thought unsettled her, but she pushed it aside. A few days later, their journey took an unexpected turn. As they trekked through a dense forest, a sudden noise broke the silence. Solara's heart raced as she whipped her head around, her instincts on high alert. Marcus was already in motion, pulling his weapon from his side. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice sharp. Solara didn't argue. For the first time since Arriving on this planet, she followed his command without hesitation. There were sounds in the trees, movement, rustling, something coming closer. Suddenly, a creature emerged from the underbrush. It was massive, with long, clawed limbs and eyes that glowed in the dark. Solara froze, staring at the creature as it advanced toward them, its growls low and menacing. Marcus didn't waste any time. He fired his weapon, the shot echoing through the forest. The creature staggered back, but it didn't stop. "Stay back, princess," Marcus shouted, stepping forward. But Solara was done standing on the sidelines. She knew what she had to do. Without a second thought, she drew her own weapon, taking aim at the creature. Together, they fought side by side, each working in sync. Solara fired, hitting the creature in the shoulder. Marcus moved in, delivering a decisive blow that finally brought the beast down. Breathing heavily, Solara turned to Marcus. "We make a good team," she said, her voice soft, but with a hint of approval. Marcus nodded, a small grin tugging at his lips. "We do." For the first time since meeting him, Solara allowed herself to smile. Days turned into weeks, and despite her best efforts to keep her distance, Princess Solara found herself growing accustomed to Marcus's presence. The constant tension that had defined their early encounters slowly began to dissolve. While she still didn't fully trust him, there was something about Marcus that made her question her earlier beliefs about humans. They had become partners, forced by circumstance, and yet their bond had deepened without either of them fully realizing it. Every time they faced a challenge, they worked together seamlessly, covering each other's weaknesses. Solara had always been proud of her independence, but now, on this foreign planet, she couldn't ignore the fact that Marcus had become her closest ally. One afternoon, as they made their way through a dense jungle, Marcus turned to her with a concerned look on his face. "Princess, you look tired. Maybe we should rest for a while." Solara frowned, irritated by his suggestion. "I'm fine," she snapped. She had never been one to admit weakness, even when her body screamed for rest. Marcus didn't argue, though the worry in his eyes didn't fade. He simply reached down and handed her a flask of water. "Drink. You'll need it if we're going to make it through the next stretch." Reluctantly, Solara accepted the water, her fingers brushing against his. The simple contact made her heart skip a beat, and she quickly looked away. Why was she so affected by something so insignificant? "Thank you," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus gave her a small nod, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned to continue their trek through the jungle. Solara followed behind him, trying to ignore the strange sensation building in her chest. That evening, as they set up camp in a small clearing, Solara sat by the fire, her mind preoccupied. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the ground, but her thoughts were far from the warmth of the fire. She couldn't stop thinking about the way Marcus had looked at her, the way he had helped her without hesitation. She had never been one to need help, but in this unfamiliar world it seemed like she couldn't survive without him. "You're thinking too hard, princess," Marcus said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. He was sitting across from her, sharpening his weapon. He had a way of reading her that she hadn't expected. Solara stiffened. "I'm not thinking about anything." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a half-smile. "You don't need to hide it. I can tell. You've been distracted for days now." Solara's cheeks flushed, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't have time for distractions," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "There's still a mission to complete." Marcus shrugged, not offended by her sharp tone. "I get it. You're a princess. You have responsibilities. But you're also human. You're allowed to think about things that aren't always about duty." Solara blinked, surprised by his words. She had never thought about it that way. To her, everything had always been about duty, about living up to expectations. Her entire life had been planned out, with little room for anything else. And yet, here on this strange planet, she was forced to confront parts of herself she had buried for years. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted, more to herself than to Marcus. "I've always known my path, but now I'm not so sure." Marcus set his weapon down and looked at her with an understanding gaze. Nobody's ever really ready for the big stuff. You just have to take it one step at a time. For a moment, Zalara didn't respond. She wanted to argue, to say that she was a princess, and she always had to be ready. But something in Marcus's voice made her pause. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was okay to not have everything figured out. The next morning, as they continued their journey, they encountered another challenge. A storm had been brewing on the horizon, and before they could find shelter, the winds began to pick up and the sky darkened. Marcus moved quickly, his experience with such weather evident as he searched for a place to take cover. "Princess, follow me," he called, his voice urgent. Zalara hesitated, watching the storm approach. She could feel the pressure in the air, the coming danger. She didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted toward Marcus, her heart pounding in her chest. They found shelter in a small cave just as the storm hit. The wind howled outside and the rain began to pour, hitting the ground with a violent force. Inside the cave it was dark and cold, but they were safe. Zalara sat down against the wall, her breath coming in heavy gasps. The adrenaline from the sprint still coursed through her veins. She looked up to find Marcus already tending to their supplies, unfazed by the storm outside. "We'll stay here until it passes," he said calmly, as if he had expected this all along. Zalara nodded, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer than she intended. She had always admired strength, but there was something else about Marcus, something that drew her to him. He was kind, competent, and dependable, and in a way that made her feel safe. The storm raged on for hours, but inside the cave, time seemed to slow. Zalara found herself sitting in silence, her thoughts swirling. She had always been taught to keep her emotions in check, to never let anyone see weakness. But now, with Marcus beside her, she was beginning to question what that really meant. "You're quiet," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "What's on your mind?" Zalara sighed, looking away. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's just, I've never been this far from home. I've always known what I had to do, what was expected of me. But now, everything's different. I don't know what to think anymore." Marcus sat down next to her, offering her a comforting smile. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. You're here, and you're doing fine." Zalara looked at him, surprised by his words. She had expected him to dismiss her concerns, to remind her of her responsibilities. But instead, he was offering something else: understanding, for the first time. Zalara let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to not have everything figured out. And as the storm raged outside, she felt the smallest seed of something new growing inside her. Something that she couldn't quite name, but something that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The storm had passed, but the landscape around them remained harsh and unforgiving. The planet's sky was still overcast, with dark clouds looming in the distance. Despite the calm, something felt wrong. Marcus could sense it, and he wasn't the only one. Zalara had become more alert over the past few days. She had begun to trust Marcus, but there was a nagging feeling at the back of her mind. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into the unknown. The creature they had fought a few days ago hadn't been the only threat lurking on this planet. Marcus had warned her about that, and now she could feel the tension building. "We need to move quickly," Marcus said, breaking the silence as he scanned the horizon. Zalara nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility press down on her. She was a princess, and it was her duty to protect her people, even if she was far from home. She had to survive. She had to finish her mission. She couldn't afford to fail now. As they moved forward, Marcus's pace quickened. He had become a guide, a protector, and, despite herself, Zalara found herself depending on him more than she cared to admit. She had always believed that strength came from within, but Marcus had shown her a different kind of strength. It was the kind of strength that came from loyalty, determination, and the willingness to do whatever it took to protect those around you. And Zalara had begun to realize that maybe there was more to leadership than she had been taught. "We're getting close," Marcus muttered, his eyes narrowing. There's a settlement up ahead, but I don't trust it. Solara felt a jolt of unease. What do you mean? I mean, we've been tracking something, he said, glancing over his shoulder. There's been a shift in the atmosphere, a strange energy. It's like we're being watched. Solara's eyes widened. Are you saying we're being followed? Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued to scan their surroundings, his posture tense, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. Possibly, he said finally. And if I'm right, we're not alone. They had only been walking for a few minutes when they heard the sound. At first, it was a low hum, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder, like the distant rumble of thunder. Solara instinctively reached for her weapon, her fingers wrapping around the hilt of her blade. She didn't wait for Marcus to tell her to be ready. She was already preparing herself for whatever was coming. Marcus held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. Wait here, he said, his voice firm. Stay out of sight. Solara didn't argue. She knew better than to question Marcus's judgment now. She crouched behind a boulder, her heart racing as the sound grew louder. She could see Marcus move ahead, his figure becoming a shadow against the dim light. He was quick, his every movement, precise and calculated. The hum grew louder still, and then through the trees, Solara saw them. A group of armed figures appeared, their silhouettes just visible in the distance. They were humanoid in shape but taller, their features sharp and angular. Solara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the symbols on their armor. They were from the same alien faction that had been hunting her for weeks. The enemy had finally found them. Marcus's voice came through the comm unit, low and urgent. We have to move now, stay close. Solara nodded, her mind racing. She had faced enemies before, but this was different. These were skilled fighters, and she was far from the safety of her empire. She had no choice but to trust Marcus. They began to move quietly through the underbrush, staying low, their footsteps muffled by the thick foliage. Solara's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the edge of the clearing. She could see the enemy's movements clearly now. They were organized, methodical, and deadly. There were at least 10 of them, and they were armed with advanced weapons that made Solara's blade seem like a relic of the past. We need a plan, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. We can't take them all head-on. I'll create a diversion. You take the rear. Solara's eyes widened. No, I won't let you face them alone. Marcus gave her a quick glance, his expression serious. You don't have a choice. I need you to cover our escape. Trust me. Solara opened her mouth to argue, but she stopped herself. She knew he was right. The odds were stacked against them, and if they were going to survive, they needed to think strategically. She nodded reluctantly. Fine, but we do this together. Marcus gave her a sharp nod before disappearing into the shadows. Moving silently like a predator, Solara didn't waste any more time. She moved into position, taking cover behind a large rock. She could hear the enemy approaching, their voices getting closer. Her heart raced, but she kept her focus, the adrenaline sharpening her senses as the enemy soldiers reached the clearing. Marcus made his move. He fired a shot into the air, a loud crack that echoed through the trees. The enemy immediately turned toward the noise, their weapons raised, scanning the area. Solara didn't wait. She darted out from behind the rock, moving with the precision she had learned from years of royal training. Her blade was a blur as she struck from behind, taking out one of the soldiers with a swift, clean move. She could hear Marcus fighting behind her, his weapon firing with deadly accuracy. The enemy soldiers reacted quickly, firing at Solara as they realized she was part of the attack. She ducked, narrowly avoiding a shot, and then countered, taking down another soldier with a quick slash, but there were too many of them. Despite their skills, Solara could feel the pressure mounting. They were being overwhelmed. Marcus, she shouted, looking over her shoulder. He was still fighting, but she could see that he was struggling. He was injured, a deep gash on his arm, blood dripping onto the ground. No, Solara cried, rushing to his side. But Marcus, despite the pain, pushed her back. Get to safety, he barked. We're not done yet. She couldn't leave him. Not now. With a burst of strength, she rushed toward the enemy, cutting through their lines with deadly precision. She fought with everything she had, driven by the need to protect the one person who had stood by her through it all. Finally, the last of the enemy soldiers fell. The clearing was silent, except for the sounds of heavy breathing. Zalara looked around, her chest heaving, and then her eyes found Marcus. He was leaning against a tree, bleeding but still conscious. "We did it," he said, a faint smile on his face. Zalara knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she helped him up. "You're hurt," she said softly. "We need to get you to safety." Marcus nodded, his face grim but filled with quiet determination. "We're not out of danger yet, but we're alive." And for the first time since this mission had begun, Zalara felt a flicker of hope. Together they had survived, and together they would make it through whatever came next. The battle had ended. The forest clearing was littered with the fallen bodies of their enemies, and the once quiet air was thick with the heavy scent of smoke. Zalara stood in the middle of the chaos, her chest heaving from exertion. The fight had been intense, but they had made it. Together they had survived. Marcus, though injured, was still standing beside her, his face pale but determined. Blood stained his shirt where he had been cut, but his eyes still held the same fierce determination that had kept them both alive since the moment they landed on this planet. Zalara couldn't help but look at him. She had always been taught that a ruler had to be strong, independent, never showing weakness. But standing here with Marcus at her side, she realized that maybe strength wasn't just about standing alone. Maybe it was about knowing when to lean on someone else. "You should rest," she said quietly, her voice softer than usual. "We need to get you patched up." Marcus shook his head, though his body swayed slightly as if the effort to remain upright was taking its toll. "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice betrayed the exhaustion he was trying to hide. Zalara stepped closer, her hands trembling as she touched his arm. "You're not fine. You're hurt. We can't move forward if you're not healed." Marcus met her gaze, and for the first time in their journey there was no challenge in his eyes. There was no resistance, no stubborn pride. There was just a quiet acceptance. "Then we rest." Together they moved toward the edge of the clearing where a small stream trickled through the trees. Marcus sat down by the water's edge, his back against a tree, while Zalara kneeled beside him. The water was cool and clear, and she washed his wounds as best as she could. There was something oddly intimate about this moment. Zalara had never been this close to anyone, not in this way. She had always kept people at arm's length, her royal duties and the weight of her title always coming first. But now with Marcus, things were different. She wasn't a princess, and he wasn't just a soldier. They were two people who had been thrown together by circumstance, forced to rely on each other for survival. As Zalara carefully cleaned his wounds, she could feel the tension between them shift. It wasn't just physical anymore. Something had changed, something deeper than either of them had expected. They had fought side by side, shared the same dangers, and now, for the first time, Zalara allowed herself to truly see Marcus for who he was. Not just a soldier, but a man who had proven time and time again that he would do anything to keep her safe. "I never thought I'd be here," Zalara said quietly, breaking the silence. "I never thought I'd be stranded on a planet like this with no one but a human soldier." Marcus chuckled softly despite the pain. "You're not alone, princess. You've never been alone." She met his gaze, surprised by the sincerity in his words. "I don't understand why you've stuck by me," she admitted. "I'm nothing but a burden to you. I've never needed anyone before. I've always been in control." "You're not a burden," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "You're a leader. You're strong, Zalara. But even the strongest people need help sometimes. Even you." Zalara's chest tightened at the words. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being the one people looked up to. But here, with Marcus, she had learned that strength wasn't just about standing tall on her own. It was about trusting others, about allowing them to help and support you when you needed it most. They sat in silence for a while, The only sound the gentle rustling of the trees and the distant call of wildlife. Solara finished tending to Marcus's wounds and sat back, her thoughts racing. She was so used to being alone, so used to carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. But with Marcus, everything felt different. She wasn't sure if it was because they had fought together or because they had survived together, but something had shifted between them. "You're not like the others," she said quietly, almost to herself. "You're not like the people I've known back home." Marcus looked at her, his expression unreadable. "How so?" "You don't care about my title," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't care that I'm a princess. You've never treated me like I'm above you." He smiled, though it was faint. "Titles don't mean much when you're stuck on a planet fighting for survival. What matters is the person standing next to you." Solara felt her heart skip a beat. She had always kept people at a distance, always kept her emotions locked away. But here, now with Marcus, she couldn't hide what she was feeling. She had come to realize that she didn't want to. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Not with you." Marcus's expression softened and he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Solara. Not anymore." Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized just how much those words meant to her until he spoke them. In that moment, everything changed. The walls she had built around herself began to crumble, and she allowed herself to feel something she had never allowed before. Together, they had survived this far. Together, they could make it through whatever else the planet threw at them. They had formed a bond, something stronger than either of them had expected. And now, as the day slowly faded into night, Solara found herself not just thinking about the mission she had come here for, but about the future, a future that for the first time felt possible. With Marcus by her side, maybe there was more to life than duty, more than her royal title. Maybe there was something worth fighting for beyond the Empire. Solara leaned back against the tree, her eyes closing as she allowed herself to relax. Marcus sat beside her, his presence a comfort she never thought she would need. But now, in the quiet of the night, she realized just how much she had come to rely on him. The future was uncertain. The journey ahead would still be difficult. But, as long as they had each other, Solara knew they could face anything.